You know, in all my years watching politics, I've learned one simple truth. When the rules of the game change, you either adapt or you get left behind. And right now, we're watching something unfold in California that most people don't fully understand yet. But believe me, the implications are massive. Before we dive into this story, if you're finding value in this analysis, go ahead and hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. It helps us continue bringing you this kind of deep dive content that cuts through the noise and gets to what really matters. Governor Gavin Newsom just pulled off what might be the most audacious political maneuver we've seen in years. He convinced California voters to throw out their independently drawn congressional maps and redraw them to favor Democrats. Now, I know what some of you are thinking sounds like typical political games, right? But there's so much more happening beneath the surface here, and the story of how we got to this point reveals something fundamental about power, strategy, and the future direction of American politics. Let me take you back to where this all started, because understanding the backstory is absolutely critical. For decades, California had a problem. Politicians were drawing their own district maps, essentially choosing their voters instead of voters choosing them. It was a rigged game, and everybody knew it. So back in 2010, California voters did something pretty remarkable. They voted to create an independent redistricting commission. The idea was simple and elegant. Take the map-making power away from politicians and give it to an independent group of citizens who would draw fair, competitive districts. It was good government reform at its finest, the kind of thing that sounds great in theory and actually worked pretty well in practice. That independent commission drew California's congressional maps in 2020, creating districts that were supposed to be fair and balanced. The commission had Republicans, Democrats, and independents working together. They held public hearings. They followed strict criteria about keeping communities together. It was the model for how redistricting should work in a democracy. California Democrats supported this system because they believed in the principle of fair elections, even when it might cost them a few seats here and there. That's the thing about principles. They're supposed to guide you even when they're inconvenient. But then Donald Trump came along and changed the entire calculation. In the summer of 2025, President Trump looked at the razor-thin Republican majority in the House of Representatives and decided he needed to pad those numbers. He focused his attention on Texas, where Republicans controlled the state government completely. Trump pushed Texas Republicans to do something that had rarely been done in American history: redraw congressional maps in the middle of the decade, not at the start of a new census like you're supposed to. The goal was crystal clear: flip 5 Democratic seats to Republican by manipulating the district boundaries. This wasn't subtle. This was a power grab, plain and simple. Now think about what that meant for a moment. Texas Republicans were essentially going to gerrymander their way to 5 more House seats, strengthening their grip on power through map-making instead of winning over voters. They targeted Democratic representatives in Austin, Dallas, Houston, and South Texas, carving up their districts to make them unwinnable for Democrats. It was brazen, and it was exactly the kind of thing that independent redistricting commissions were designed to prevent. But Texas didn't have an independent commission. Texas had Republican politicians drawing maps to help Republican politicians, and Trump was cheering them on every step of the way. This put Gavin Newsom in an impossible position. Here's a guy who had supported California's independent commission. He believed in fair redistricting. He believed in good government reforms. But now he was watching Trump and Texas Republicans tear up the rulebook and grab power through blatant manipulation of the democratic process. If California stuck to its principles and kept its fair maps while Texas gerrymandered to gain 5 Republican seats, Democrats would be handing control of the House to the Republicans for potentially the next decade. Sometimes principles run headfirst into political reality, and you have to make a choice. Newsom made his choice, and it shocked a lot of people. In late July 2025, he held a press conference at the governor's mansion in Sacramento, with members of the Texas Democratic congressional delegation standing beside him. The symbolism was deliberate. Newsom announced that if Texas moved forward with their mid-decade gerrymander, California would fight fire with fire. He said it was time for Democrats to play hardball, to stop holding hands and talking about the way the world should be and start acting differently. These weren't just words. This was a declaration of political war. But Newsom faced a huge obstacle. California's Independent Redistricting Commission was written into the state constitution. You couldn't just wave it away because it was politically inconvenient. So Newsom and his team came up with a creative legal strategy. They argued that the independent commission was only required to draw maps at the start of each decade, when new census data came out. Mid-decade redistricting, they claimed, was an open question. The Constitution didn't explicitly prohibit the legislature from drawing new maps between census cycles. It was a legal argument that would make any good lawyer smile, finding the loophole in what looked like an airtight system. Armed with this interpretation, Newsom went to work lobbying the Democratic-controlled California legislature, and here's where his political skills really shined. Newsom had been successfully working lawmakers for weeks before he went public with the plan. By the time he announced it to the world, he already had the votes lined up. In August 2025, the California legislature moved with remarkable speed. They passed a bill calling for a special election on Proposition 50, a ballot measure that would suspend the current congressional districts and replace them with a new map designed to flip 5 Republican-held seats to Democrats. The legislature also passed the actual redistricting map itself, sending it to Newsom's desk, and they passed a third bill to facilitate and fund the special election. All of this happened in a matter of days. The Assembly vote was 54-24, almost perfectly along party lines. The Senate followed suit with a 30-8 vote, also along party lines. Newsom immediately declared November 4, 2025 as the date for the special election. From announcement to election day, the whole operation took just over 3 months. In politics, that's lightning speed. Now, the campaign itself was fascinating to watch, and it revealed so much about how modern political campaigns work in an era of deep polarization. On one side, you had Newsom and California Democrats arguing this was a necessary response to Trump's attack on democracy. They said they didn't want to abandon the independent commission, but they had no choice. If Democrats unilaterally disarmed while Republicans gerrymandered across the country, they'd be sacrificing their ability to protect voting rights, health care, climate action, and every other policy priority Democrats cared about. Sometimes you have to bend your principles to protect your values, they argued. It was a nuanced position, but Newsom sold it with passion and urgency. The Yes on Proposition 50 campaign was incredibly well-funded and professionally run. Democratic donors who were terrified of permanent Republican control of Congress opened their wallets wide. Labor unions threw their support behind the measure. Progressive groups mobilized volunteers across the state. The campaign ran television ads showing Trump's attacks on California, reminding voters of everything that was at stake. They framed it not as gerrymandering, but as self-defense against Trump's unprecedented power grab. The messaging was sophisticated and targeted, hitting different demographics with customized appeals about what they stood to lose if Republicans maintained control of Congress through manipulated maps. On the other side, you had Republicans and good government groups arguing this was hypocrisy of the highest order. California Democrats had spent years criticizing Republican gerrymandering, holding up their independent commission as a model for the nation. Now they were throwing it all away at the first sign of political inconvenience. If Democrats really believed in fair maps, they should stick to their principles no matter what Texas did. Otherwise, they were just as bad as the Republicans they criticized. It was a powerful argument grounded in consistency and principle. The opponent leading the charge against Proposition 50 was Charles Munger, Jr., a Republican megadonor who had actually funded the original Independent Redistricting Commission back in 2010. Munger poured money into the No campaign, arguing that California shouldn't descend into the same partisan map-making that plagued other states. He had a compelling message: don't become what you hate, don't let Trump drag you down to his level, hold the line on good government reform. For a while, early polls showed the race could go either way. Support for Proposition 50 was soft. Californians liked their independent commission. They weren't sure they wanted to give it up, even temporarily. But Newsom proved to be a master campaigner. He reframed the entire debate around Trump. This wasn't about abandoning principles, he argued. This was about standing up to Trump's unprecedented attack on democracy. Trump had broken the rules, so Democrats had to respond in kind to prevent a complete Republican takeover of Congress. Newsom called it an existential moment. He said Californians could de facto end Trump's presidency by helping Democrats win back the House. It was a powerful appeal to Democratic voters who were terrified of Trump's second term. The messaging worked. By Election Day, the polls had shifted dramatically. The Public Policy Institute of California showed 56% support for Proposition 50. The Berkeley Institute of Governmental Studies had it even higher at 60%. And when the votes came in, it wasn't even close. Proposition 50 passed with overwhelming support, well above 60%. Voter turnout for a special election was unprecedented. Democrats came out in force to send a message to Trump and the Republicans. Newsom's victory speech at the California Democratic Party headquarters was triumphant. He said California had stood tall and stood firm in response to Trump's recklessness. After poking the bear, he said, the bear roared with extraordinary turnout and an extraordinary result. But Newsom also struck a note of caution. He warned his supporters not to let down their guard, saying Trump would continue to try to intimidate people and gain more congressional seats in other states. The fight wasn't over. This was just the first round. Trump's response was exactly what you'd expect. Early on Election Day, he took to social media claiming, without any evidence, that the vote was rigged. He vowed a legal and criminal review of the election, threatening to use the Justice Department to investigate California's electoral process. It was classic Trump attacking the legitimacy of any election he didn't like. But the reality was that Proposition 50 had won fair and square, with turnout and margins that made challenges virtually impossible. Now here's where it gets really interesting from a strategic perspective. Newsom didn't just focus on California. After the election, he explicitly called on other Democratic governors in Virginia, Maryland, New York, Illinois, and Colorado to follow California's lead. He said Democrats needed to put up a show of force against Trump. He talked about the sobriety of the moment and what was at stake. If enough Democratic states redrew their maps to counter Republican gerrymanders, Democrats could win back the House in 2026 and effectively end Trump's ability to push his agenda through Congress. This was Newsom positioning himself not just as California's governor, but as a national leader of the Democratic resistance to Trump. And it was working. Suddenly, Newsom was on national news every night, standing up to the president, rallying Democrats across the country. His approval ratings in California shot up among Democrats, even as Republicans denounced him as a hypocrite. Love him or hate him, Newsom had successfully claimed the mantle of Trump's most prominent challenger. But there's a fascinating subplot to this whole story that tells you everything about politics and ambition. Exit polls after the election revealed that 53% of Californians didn't want Newsom to run for president in 2028. Think about that for a second. Newsom had just engineered this massive victory, rallied Democrats to his cause, and demonstrated real political skill and courage. And yet, a majority of voters in his home state still didn't want him running for president. It's a reminder that winning battles and winning wars are two different things. That doesn't mean Newsom won't run. In fact, most political observers think this whole redistricting fight was partly about building his national profile for a 2028 presidential campaign. If those 5 new Democratic seats in California help Democrats win back the House in 2026, Newsom can claim credit for changing the balance of power in Washington. That's exactly the kind of accomplishment that makes you a serious presidential contender. Newsom is betting that Democratic primary voters will remember who stood up and fought when it mattered, even if California voters are lukewarm about his presidential ambitions right now. The irony in all of this is almost too perfect. Democrats spent years arguing that gerrymandering was destroying democracy. They pointed to Republican-drawn maps in states like North Carolina, Ohio, and Wisconsin as examples of how politicians were rigging the system. They championed independent commissions as the solution. They made fair maps a core part of their good government agenda. And then, when it really mattered, when sticking to those principles would have cost them power, they abandoned the independent commission and drew their own partisan maps. Now, you can make 2 arguments about this, and they're both legitimate depending on your perspective. The first argument is that Democrats are hypocrites who only believe in fair maps when it benefits them politically. They talk a good game about democratic norms and principles, but when push comes to shove, they're just as willing to manipulate the system for partisan advantage as Republicans are. This was a test of their values, and they failed it. They proved that power matters more than principles. The second argument is that Democrats were faced with an impossible choice and made the pragmatic decision. If they'd stuck to their principles, while Republicans gerrymandered across the country, they'd have been noble losers. And noble losers don't get to protect voting rights, health care, climate policy, or any of the other issues Democrats care about. Sometimes you have to fight fire with fire. Sometimes you have to get your hands dirty to prevent something worse. Democrats didn't want to abandon the independent commission, but Trump's unprecedented mid-decade gerrymander forced their hand. I've thought a lot about which of these arguments I find more compelling, and here's what I've concluded. They're both right, and that's what makes this story so fascinating. Yes, Democrats compromised their principles. Yes, they engaged in the same kind of partisan map-making they'd spent years criticizing. That's hypocrisy, and we should call it what it is. But it's also true that they were responding to an unprecedented assault on the democratic process by Trump and Republican-controlled states. If Democrats had unilaterally disarmed while Republicans armed themselves, the consequences would have been severe and lasting. This gets to something deeper about politics and power that I think a lot of people don't fully appreciate. Principles are important. Values matter. Good government reforms like independent redistricting make our democracy stronger. But principles and values exist in a political context, and when your opponents abandon all norms and restraints, sticking rigidly to your principles might mean losing the ability to defend anything you value. It's a dilemma as old as democracy itself. How do you fight those who don't fight fair without becoming like them? Newsom's answer was clear. You fight back. You match their tactics. You don't bring a knife to a gunfight. And if that means temporarily suspending the independent commission you once supported, so be it. The ends justify the means when the alternative is permanent Republican control of Congress through gerrymandering. It's a utilitarian argument, and it has real merit. But it also comes with costs. Once you start making exceptions to your principles, where do you draw the line? How do you know when you've gone too far? The consequences of Proposition 50 are still playing out. The new congressional map targets 5 Republican incumbents in California. Voter registration in those districts has been adjusted to favor Democrats, but actually winning those seats in the 2026 midterm elections is a different challenge. Republicans aren't going to give up without a fight. They'll pour money into those races. They'll attack the new maps as illegitimate gerrymanders. They'll try to paint Democrats as power-hungry hypocrites willing to destroy democratic norms for partisan gain. Meanwhile, the legal challenges are already starting. Conservative legal groups are filing lawsuits arguing that California's mid-decade redistricting violates the state constitution. They say the independent commission isn't just recommended for the start of the decade, it's required for all redistricting. It'll be up to the courts to decide whether Newsom's legal interpretation holds up. If the courts strike down the new maps, Democrats will have gone through this entire fight for nothing. They'll have damaged their credibility on good government issues without even gaining the 5 seats they were aiming for. There's also the question of what happens in other states. Will Democratic governors in New York, Illinois, Maryland, Virginia, and Colorado follow Newsom's lead and redraw their own maps? Some of them have already started exploring the possibility. If several Democratic states gerrymander in response to Republican gerrymanders, we could see a complete breakdown of any remaining norms around redistricting. The country could descend into a free-for-all where every state redraws maps whenever it's politically convenient, creating chaos and undermining faith in the electoral process even further. On the other hand, there are signs that Newsom's aggressive response might actually deter further Republican gerrymanders. Some Republican-controlled state legislatures have reportedly backed off their plans to redraw maps mid-decade after seeing California's reaction. The calculation changes when Democrats demonstrate they're willing to fight back just as hard. Maybe the threat of mutually assured destruction through competing gerrymanders will restore some equilibrium to the system. It's possible that Newsom's willingness to play hardball actually reinforces democratic norms in the long run by making clear that norm breaking comes with consequences. There's also been a fascinating development in Texas, the state that started this whole mess. A federal court recently blocked the new Republican-drawn congressional map that Trump had pushed for. The judges ruled that the mid-decade redistricting violated the Voting Rights Act by discriminating against minority voters. If that ruling stands, it would nullify the Republican seat gains in Texas that Newsom was responding to, which raises an interesting question. If the Texas gerrymander gets struck down, should California reverse course and go back to its independent commission maps, or has that ship already sailed? What I find most interesting about this entire saga is what it reveals about the state of American politics in 2026. We're in an era where norms and informal rules that once constrained political behavior are breaking down. Trump showed that you could violate democratic norms and not only survive, but thrive politically. That lesson hasn't been lost on politicians in either party. If breaking the rules works and your opponents aren't going to punish you for it, why would you constrain yourself? It's a race to the bottom, and we're watching it happen in real time. But let's dig deeper into what these norms actually were and why they mattered. For most of American history, redistricting happened once every 10 years after the census. That's what the Constitution requires for reapportioning House seats among the states, and by tradition, states would redraw their district lines at the same time. This created a predictable rhythm. Politicians knew they'd have stable districts for a decade, which gave them time to build relationships with constituents and develop expertise on issues. Voters knew their representatives and understood which district they lived in. The system had problems, particularly when it came to partisan gerrymandering, but at least it was stable and predictable. Mid-decade redistricting throws all of that out the window. When states can redraw maps whenever they want, district boundaries become fluid and uncertain. Representatives never know if their district will be eliminated or dramatically changed before the next election. Voters lose track of who represents them. The whole process becomes chaotic and overtly partisan. That's why mid-decade redistricting had been rare historically. Even in states where one party controlled everything, there was an understanding that you didn't redraw maps between censuses unless there was a court order requiring it or some other extraordinary circumstance. Trump shattered that norm. He looked at the narrow Republican House majority and decided that mid-decade redistricting in Texas and other red states was worth the political cost. He calculated that Democrats wouldn't fight back effectively, and Republicans would lock in control of Congress for years through aggressive gerrymandering. It was a high-stakes gamble based on the assumption that Democrats would stick to their principles even when it meant losing power. For a while, it looked like Trump might be right. Democratic leaders condemned the Texas plan but seemed unsure how to respond. Newsom's redistricting plan is a perfect example of this dynamic. He looked at Trump breaking the rules in Texas and made a strategic calculation. Stick to principles and lose power, or match Trump's tactics and fight for control of Congress. He chose to fight, and California Democrats overwhelmingly supported that choice. They decided that defending their policy priorities mattered more than maintaining their commitment to independent redistricting. It's easy to judge that decision from the outside, but put yourself in their shoes for a moment. What would you have done?